"Shut up," my dad barked, and the word hit before his foot did, a flat, hard command that made the kitchen feel smaller than the square of light under the stove hood. Pain shot through my ribs, bright and fast, and I folded around it like paper while my sister laughed, thin and sharp, like she was hiding behind the sound. "Before I tell you the whole story, tell me where you're watching from and whether you've ever felt betrayed by your own family, because if you've been there, you already know how the room stays the same while your life changes forever." I was 15, small for my age though I pretended not to notice, and that afternoon I had made the mistake of breathing wrong at the wrong time, asking if I could stay late after school for a study group when Dad had already decided we were going to my grandfather's to fix a gutter, because in our house wanting something was the same as talking back. "You don't need friends," he said, pulling open a drawer the way some people pull a ripcord. "You need to remember who feeds you." Mom rinsed plates without looking at me. She always found a surface to clean when his voice rose, as if the sink could be a shield, as if she cleaned enough she could polish the anger off the world. My sister Macy was 17 and tall and pretty and knew how to lean into trouble without letting it touch her. She rolled her eyes and said, "Seriously, Liv, just shut up," almost playfully, and for a second I thought she might be on my side, and then she laughed when I flinched, and the laugh felt like someone stepping on my hand when I reached for help. If you want to know what abuse looks like, it doesn't always look like fists. Sometimes it looks like dinner on time and a report card on the fridge and nobody asking why you wear long sleeves in June. It looks like a father who isn't drunk, just sure he's right. It looks like a sister who learned the rules before you and decided the safest place to stand was next to the person holding the hammer. He didn't kick me hard enough to knock me down, not in the way that leaves you sprawled for the neighbors to see, just hard enough to make a point, to push the air out of me and fold me quiet, a precise correction like you'd give a dog caught on the couch. "She's fine," Macy said, and Dad nodded, satisfied, and the moment traveled on like a train passing the station, except my body didn't get the schedule, my ribs pulsed, and when I tried to breathe deep the breath snagged like thread on a nail. Mom set a plate on the counter for me as if I'd been out for a run, as if nothing had happened, as if my silence were a nap. I took 2 bites and stood up too fast, the world leaning. I told Mom I needed the bathroom and she said, "Don't be dramatic," but she didn't stop me when I went down the hall clutching my side. In the mirror my face was pale, that sick gray that tells secrets you're not ready to say out loud. I lifted my shirt and saw the place already shadowing, a rush of bruise like a storm trying to make land. I thought about how teachers say if something happens you should tell someone, but my school had a poster about kindness over a trash can that always smelled like milk, and I didn't think a poster could help me breathe. That night I lay on my side and counted, not sheep but seconds, because counting kept me from remembering the exact angle of his foot, and when the pain made me sit up and gasp, I pressed my palm to my ribs and told myself I was dramatic, I was clumsy. I bumped into the counter, learned lines I could say without choking on them. In our house we were all actors and Dad was the director and the script was compliance. Morning came slow and thick, and when I reached for my backpack, a hot spear of pain made me see static. I made a sound I didn't mean to make, and Macy, already perfect in her cheer uniform even though the season hadn't started, looked up and smirked, like pain was a joke I kept telling. "What now?" she said, because in our family nothing happened unless he decided it did. I tried to stretch and couldn't, and the look on Mom's face went tight, that look she saved for near accidents on the highway, and she said, "We're going to be late, girls," and I heard the prayer inside the sentence, the one that said let the day pass without a scene. I got through first period by not moving, a statue with a pencil, and when I sneezed during biology the pain was so sudden I grabbed the lab table and left fingerprints on the dust near the microscopes. Mr. Kellogg, who always wore ties with tiny whales on them because his wife bought his clothes in bulk at the outlet mall, bent down and said quietly, "Olivia, can you take a deep breath for me?" and when I tried, the breath tore. He didn't make a speech, he just wrote a note and walked me to the nurse, and the nurse took one look and said, "We're going to get you checked out," and made a call that felt like a stone dropped down a well, the way the sound disappears then echoes up somewhere else. At the clinic the waiting room was filled with old magazines and the smell of hand sanitizer, and every chair squeaked like it had a secret. I kept my eyes on a poster about drinking water, all those cheerful droplets pretending the human body is simple if you pour enough into it. The doctor who finally called my name was young enough to smile without it feeling like a mask. She had a quick, decisive walk, like she knew the way out of mazes, and a name tag that said Dr. Klein. She asked me to lift my shirt and I hesitated, and she said, "No one will touch you without your consent," and my eyes stung because the sentence was so ordinary, but in my life it felt like someone opened a window in a room I thought was welded shut. She pressed gently along my ribs, and even the gentleness hurt, as if kindness were a light too bright for eyes used to dark. "How did this happen, Olivia?" she asked, and my mouth moved before my brain decided, the words walking the line they always walk. "I bumped the counter, I fell, I'm clumsy, I'm fine." She didn't argue, she looked at the bruise like it was a message that had been trying to reach someone for a long time and said, "We're going to do an X-ray to be safe," and safe was a word I only knew from books. The X-ray room was cold and smelled like metal, the machine a huge, patient animal, and when the tech told me to hold still I wished I could hold still forever, freeze at 15 before the next thing happened. After the hum and the click and the software of images printing on the screen, Dr. Klein came back with a film against the light, bones floating like pale branches. "You have a non-displaced fracture on the 7th rib," she said, and then she added, "This pattern is consistent with a direct blow." The room didn't tip, it clarified. My body had testified even if I hadn't. She sat on the stool and met my eyes and said, "Olivia, I believe you," and the sentence landed somewhere in my chest that wasn't broken. Believe is different than fix, and different than rescue, but it is the first step in a path you don't have to walk barefoot at night. "Is there anyone we can call who makes you feel safe?" she asked, and the answer in my head was no, because safety is complicated when the people whose names are on your insurance are the reason you need it. I thought of my English teacher who once wrote, "You see clearly," in the margin of my essay about fog. I thought of the neighbor Ms. Patel who left a basket on our porch when Mom had the flu and Dad told her not to make us look needy. I thought of a cousin in another state who sent me a Christmas card with glitter that stuck to my thumb for days, proof that touch can be gentle even if it travels through the mail. Dr. Klein didn't rush the silence, she let it sit next to us like a third person we were trying to name. Then she said, "I'm a mandated reporter. That means when I see injuries like this, I'm required by law to contact Child Protective Services. It doesn't mean you're in trouble. It means you're important enough that your safety is more than a family decision." My heart did the strangest thing, it knocked hard like a trapped bird and then steadied, as if it had been waiting for a clock to set its hands. I thought about Dad's voice when he says shut up, the way it tries to take all the air in the room for itself. I thought about Macy's laugh, the shelter she built out of denial. I thought about how the word family tastes different depending on who is holding it. "Okay," I said, my voice small but there, and the syllables felt like standing up after kneeling too long. She explained the steps like a map: CPS, a social worker, a temporary plan, maybe a safe relative, maybe a foster placement, definitely follow-up care, counseling if I wanted it, and she said the word trauma the way some people say weather, not to minimize it but to normalize the fact that it exists and is allowed to be discussed in daylight. She asked if I wanted water. I said yes just to practice what it felt like to want something and receive it. When the nurse brought the cup, my hand shook a little, a tremor you might miss if you weren't looking, but Dr. Klein noticed everything, She noticed the way I glanced at the door when footsteps passed, the way my shoulders rose whenever someone laughed in the hall, like laughter belonged to Macy and meant danger. "No one will come in here unless you say so," she reminded me, and I nodded and tried to let the sentence grow roots. While we waited for the social worker, Dr. Klein took notes in a neat, steady hand. The pen made a quiet sound, a small insistence that truth could have a paper trail. She asked permission to photograph the bruise and I said yes, and when the flash went off it felt like the moment a storm gets named, not because naming stops it but because now people can track its path. I didn't tell her everything, not then. I didn't tell her about the time Dad clenched his jaw so hard at a school concert I could hear his teeth, or the way Mom apologized with casseroles instead of words, or the night Macy stood in my doorway and said, "He wouldn't be like this if you didn't provoke him," like I had a talent for summoning weather. I didn't tell her how small the inside of my head could get when I tried to plan a future, how the only thing I could picture was surviving to the next Sunday. But I told her enough. Enough for her to say the word safe again. Enough for a system to turn its face toward me. Enough for the first brick in a path. If you're listening to this and thinking, why didn't you run, why didn't you fight, I want you to know that sometimes victory looks like letting someone measure your bruise under good light. Sometimes revenge starts with a document and a witness. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is say okay to help from a stranger who sees you not as a problem to manage but as a life to protect. The door opened after a gentle knock and a woman stepped in with a laminated badge and a calm that made me think of deep water. She introduced herself as Ms. Alvarez from CPS and said my name like a promise she intended to keep. "Olivia, we're going to make a plan," she said, and I exhaled despite the hurt. Because a plan is a kind of home you can carry until you find a better one. That was the moment the story you're here for truly began, not with a scream but with a sentence and a signature, not with blood but with the steady turn of someone else's spine toward your side. If you've ever had a day that changes the angle of your life by a degree you can only measure later, this was mine, and the next part, what my father did when he realized the house wouldn't stay silent. What my sister said when the truth didn't match her costume, what it took to become someone who could breathe without permission, you'll need to hear, because sometimes getting free is the most honest revenge there is. The ride home from the clinic was not with my father, not with my mother clutching the wheel in silence, but with Ms. Alvarez from CPS who drove a government sedan that smelled faintly of coffee and lavender hand cream. A smell so different from the tobacco and sweat that lived in my dad's truck that I almost cried just from breathing it in. She spoke softly, not the fake soft you use with toddlers but the kind that leaves space in every word, and she explained that tonight I would not go back to my house, not while there was an open case, not with an x-ray showing a fracture, not with my eyes still wide like I had seen a ghost that lived in my own kitchen. I stared out the window and the streets looked both familiar and foreign, the same grocery store sign flickering OPN instead of open, the same gas station with prices my dad cursed at, but from this seat it felt like I was watching a town I might never belong to again. When we pulled into a modest two-story house with peeling blue paint and a swing set out back, Ms. Alvarez told me this was the foster home where I would stay temporarily, with a couple who had done this before, people trained to handle emergencies like me, as if I were both a fire and the survivor of a fire. The door opened before we knocked, and a woman with warm brown eyes and hair pulled back in a messy bun smiled and said, "You must be Olivia, I'm Karen," and behind her a man in a flannel shirt waved awkwardly and said, "Call me Rob." They didn't flinch when they saw me holding my side, they didn't ask for explanations. They just showed me a small room with a quilt on the bed and a lamp that actually worked, and Karen said, "You're safe here," words that still felt fragile but heavier now, like bricks instead of paper. That night I lay on a mattress that smelled of detergent instead of smoke, listening to the hum of their refrigerator down the hall, and I thought about how silence can feel different depending on who keeps it, In my old house silence was a threat, here it was a blanket. But nothing inside me was fixed. Every time I closed my eyes I heard my father's bark, saw Macy smirk, remembered Mom's averted gaze. I wondered if they were eating dinner without me, if Dad was pacing, if Macy was telling her version of events already, painting me as dramatic, attention-seeking, ungrateful. In my head I could already hear Dad saying to anyone who asked, "She bruises easy, she lies for sympathy," and the worst part was knowing some people would believe him, because abusers always sound convincing when the only witnesses are too scared to speak. At school the next week, whispers spread faster than announcements. Some kids saw me leave with a social worker, others noticed the bruise blooming under my sleeve, and rumors multiplied like rabbits. "She got into a fight," one said. "She fell down the stairs," another guessed. Macy walked the halls like a queen, laughing extra loudly with her friends, tossing her hair like she had nothing to hide, and when our eyes met she mouthed, "Traitor," as if my broken rib had betrayed her instead of my father's foot betraying me. I sat alone at lunch, chewing carefully because laughing hurt too much, and I thought about how unfair it was that pain isolates you twice, first when it's inflicted, second when it scares people away. Ms. Alvarez met me at school one afternoon, pulling me into a small conference room with pastel posters, and she asked me gently about my past, not just the kick but the patterns, the history, the little injustices that had piled up like bricks on my chest. I told her about the time Dad threw my science project into the trash because I had taped the poster crooked, about how Macy got a new phone when she cried but I had to beg for money for field trips, about how Mom once told me, "Don't upset him, it's easier this way," as if survival were the same as love. Ms. Alvarez nodded and wrote everything down, her pen moving like a recording device that finally worked after years of silence, and she said, "Patterns matter. The court listens when there's a pattern." Court. The word rattled in my bones like a bell I wasn't ready to hear, but also like a promise that this wasn't just about a single bruise, it was about the whole crooked house we had been forced to live in. At night in Karen and Rob's house, I sometimes overheard them talking in the kitchen, their voices low but not angry, and I realized how rare it was to hear disagreement without fear. Once Rob forgot to take out the trash and Karen teased him, not cruel, just amused, and he laughed and kissed her cheek, and I stared at the ceiling in my room wondering if love could really look like that, if someday I could build a house where footsteps didn't mean danger. But healing is not a straight line, and there were mornings I woke up convinced I had made everything worse, that Macy would hate me forever, that Mom would never forgive me, that Dad would come storming through the door and drag me back. The social worker told me nightmares were normal, but nothing felt normal, not even breathing. Still, the seed had been planted, someone believed me, someone wrote it down, someone called it what it was, abuse. And once a word is named, it cannot be unnamed. That was the beginning of a war I hadn't chosen but would have to finish, a war fought not with fists but with truth, with documents, with people who showed up in rooms where my father couldn't shout his way to victory. Part 2 of my story is this: the quiet before the storm of court dates and confrontations, the uneasy safety of a borrowed room, the loneliness of being right when everyone wants you to be wrong. And if you've ever been in that place, you know the hardest revenge isn't anger. It's surviving long enough to prove them wrong. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, a crisp envelope with the county seal, and Karen placed it on the table beside my cereal like it was an invitation, except my stomach dropped when I saw my last name printed in black across the front because nothing good ever came attached to Jenkins in official ink. It was notice of a hearing, juvenile court, protective order review, the kind of paperwork that meant my father had been informed and my mother had been summoned and Macy would be pulled into a room where lies could dress themselves up as loyalty. That night I lay awake and pictured the courtroom, rows of benches, a judge with tired eyes, my father in his pressed shirt pretending to be a man of principle, my mother twisting her wedding ring like a talisman, Macy smirking as if all of this were just theater and she had the best role. At school the tension grew heavier, not just from whispers but from the way teachers looked at me longer than usual, pity in their eyes they didn't know how to hide. Macy passed me in the hall one day and hissed, "You think they'll believe you? You're nothing without us," and her words slid under my skin sharper than Dad's foot had, because abuse from a parent is expected in a way you wish it weren't, but betrayal from a sister cuts sideways, unexpected, like glass in soup. At the foster home I began writing everything down in a cheap spiral notebook Karen bought me from the dollar store, not because I thought I was a writer but because Ms. Alvarez told me memory is a fragile witness and judges like details, so I wrote about the sound of his boot, the shape of the bruise, the smell of whiskey when he said he wasn't drunk, the exact words Macy used when she called me weak. Every page felt like building a wall brick by brick, shaky at first but growing taller, proof that I wasn't just making this up. Rob told me once after dinner, "Paper doesn't flinch," and he was right. The notebook didn't look away, didn't laugh, didn't call me dramatic, it just kept the truth safe until someone asked for it. Then came visitation. CPS arranged a monitored meeting at a neutral center, pastel walls, toys stacked in corners for toddlers, and I sat in a plastic chair with my ribs aching still because bones heal slower than hearts, waiting for the door to open. My mom walked in first, eyes red, voice soft, whispering, "Olivia, baby," like I was 5 again, but behind her Dad filled the doorway, larger than life, his voice already rehearsed for the staff in the room. "This is ridiculous," he barked. She bruised herself to get attention. He glared at me like I was a stranger, and Macy followed, arms crossed, leaning into him like the loyal soldier she'd chosen to be. I wanted to vanish, but Ms. Alvarez's hand on my shoulder reminded me I wasn't invisible anymore. I was visible, painfully visible, and that visibility was my only shield. Dad leaned forward and hissed low enough that only I could hear, "You think you can ruin me? You'll regret this." Macy giggled, covering it with a cough, and I realized they thought intimidation still worked, that fear was still my leash. But then Ms. Alvarez said clearly, "Threats in this setting will be documented," and she wrote something on her clipboard, and the look on Dad's face shifted, not shame, never shame, but calculation, the sudden awareness that his world was no longer entirely under his command. That moment became my private ember, the beginning of seeing that power could be balanced, that his voice wasn't the final word. Still, when I returned to the foster home, I cried into the quilt Karen had tucked around me, guilt twisting because part of me still longed for Mom's arms, still wanted Macy to choose me, still wondered if maybe I had exaggerated, maybe the bruise was my fault after all. Trauma is a master of gaslighting. It teaches you to doubt even the X-rays. But the notebook was there, the doctor's photos were there, Ms. Alvarez was there, all the small receipts piling into something bigger. One evening Karen sat beside me and said, "Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the truth without letting it break you again." Her words sank deeper than I admitted, and that night I wrote in my notebook not just what had happened but what I wanted. To be free, to help others someday, to build a life where laughter meant joy instead of cruelty. I didn't know it yet, but those words were the first blueprint of the revenge story you're listening to now. The revenge of living well, of surviving, of someday standing in front of others and saying, "I made it out, and so can you." The days before the hearing stretched like rubber bands, snapping back on me every time I thought I could breathe without pain. And loneliness became its own language, one I learned fluently at 15 because every voice I used to lean on had either gone silent or turned against me. Mom left one voicemail, short and trembling, "Please just come home, we can fix this as a family," and for a second I almost believed her, but then I remembered her hands drying plates while Dad's boot left its print on my ribs, remembered her eyes refusing to meet mine when Macy laughed, and the voicemail became a ghost of comfort that died before it reached my chest. Macy posted a picture on social media of herself smiling in our kitchen, captioned "Family First," and the comments filled with likes and hearts, people telling her how beautiful she looked, how lucky she was, and I stared at the screen feeling like the villain in my own story, like maybe the world had already chosen sides and I was the odd one out. At school, desks shifted away from mine, not out of malice but out of the invisible weight of discomfort, because no one knows what to say to a girl whose father might be on trial and whose ribs are still healing. Better to look away, safer to pretend it isn't happening. Even the teachers, well-meaning, walked on eggshells, and their careful smiles were like bandages too loose to stick. I began eating lunch in the library, hidden behind shelves that smelled of dust and forgotten ink, where the quiet didn't judge me and the only witnesses were paperbacks that had absorbed 1,000 other tragedies before mine. Some nights in the foster home, when the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the stairs felt too normal to belong to me, I lay awake wondering if I had done the wrong thing, if speaking up had doomed me to a life of drifting, always the girl who broke her family instead of the girl who survived her father. Doubt is the sharpest weapon abusers leave behind. It cuts long after the bruises fade. I pressed my hand to my ribs and whispered to myself, it wasn't my fault, but the words trembled like they were walking across ice. Rob knocked on my door once, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate, and said, "I don't know what you believe about yourself right now, but I want you to know we believe you," and his voice cracked just slightly, the way voices do when they are telling the most important truth they have. I sipped slowly, the warmth anchoring me, and for the first time in days I slept without jolting awake at phantom footsteps. Still, the shadow of the coming hearing loomed. I pictured Dad's glare, Macy's smirk, Mom's silence, and I felt like David stepping into an arena without a stone. That was when Dr. Klein called to check in, her voice steady as always, asking how the pain was, reminding me to breathe deeply even if it hurt because lungs need practice too, and at the end she said, "You are stronger than you think, Olivia. Bones heal. Spirits heal too." I clung to that sentence like a rope in water, not because I fully believed it yet but because someone else said it, and sometimes belief has to be borrowed until it can be owned. The night before the hearing I opened my notebook and wrote in capital letters, "I will not be silent." It was the first time I declared something instead of documenting it. And though my hand shook, the ink dried bold. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of tin, heavy and undecided, and Karen drove me downtown while Rob squeezed my shoulder at the door and said, "Truth has longer legs than lies, it just takes time to catch up." The courthouse smelled of polish and paper, voices echoing off marble walls, every sound too big for my chest. We sat on a bench outside the courtroom until Ms. Alvarez appeared, calm in her gray blazer, clipboard tucked under her arm, and when she smiled at me it wasn't the kind of smile adults give to children to pretend everything will be fine, it was the steady kind that says, "I will stand with you no matter how loud they shout." She crouched to meet my eyes and said, "Olivia, today is about telling the truth, not about winning or losing, because when the truth is spoken clearly it creates its own weight." Her words settled into me like stones I could walk across. Inside the courtroom, Dad sat rigid, jaw set, his tie too tight, Macy beside him whispering in his ear like a co-counsel of cruelty, and Mom in her floral blouse wringing her hands. I felt their eyes pierce me, but before the panic could rise too high, Dr. Klein entered carrying a folder, her presence cutting through the tension like light. She nodded at me, and I realized she wasn't just my doctor today, she was my ally, armed with proof my father couldn't shout away. When it was her turn, she stood at the witness table and described my injury with precise language, the X-rays projected on a screen behind her, my ribs glowing pale against black. "This fracture," she said evenly, "is consistent with direct blunt force trauma, not a fall, not an accident. Dad muttered under his breath. Macy rolled her eyes, but the judge leaned closer, pen scratching, and the gavel of truth struck a silent beat in the room. When it was my turn, I clutched my notebook like a lifeline, and though my voice shook, I read aloud some of what I had written, the date, the bruise, the words shut up that still echoed in my chest. My hands trembled, but the paper did not, and that steadiness carried me through. Ms. Alvarez added her report, documenting the threats at visitation, noting every detail Dad thought would vanish in air. The confrontation didn't end with handcuffs or shouting, not yet, but the judge ordered supervised visits only and extended protective oversight, and I saw the first crack in my father's mask when the order was read. He wasn't invincible anymore. Outside the courtroom, I sagged into a chair, exhausted, but Dr. Klein crouched beside me and said, "You did something extraordinary today. You told the truth out loud." And Ms. Alvarez added, "Now we build a plan, because survival is just the first chapter. Thriving is the rest." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just a scared girl in borrowed clothes. I was a witness, I was a fighter, and I had allies who carried receipts sharper than any insult my family could throw. That night at the foster home, I opened my notebook, and for the first time I didn't just record what had happened. I started drafting what could happen next: finish school, find therapy, choose people who don't laugh when I hurt. The plan was fragile, but it was mine, and every plan begins with a single sentence written in your own hand. Back at the foster home, the world felt both safer and sharper, as if every corner held a test I wasn't sure I could pass, but Ms. Alvarez reminded me again and again that survival without strategy was just waiting, and strategy was how people like us turned pain into power. So I began building my own kind of arsenal, not of weapons but of proof. Every evening after homework I opened my notebook and added details, times, exact words, the way Macy sneered when she passed me in the hall, the way Dad's voice dropped to a growl in the courthouse lobby when he thought no one was listening, the tremor in Mom's hands when she signed forms she didn't want to sign. Rob taught me how to use the cheap tape recorder he dug out of a drawer, and though it was meant for interviews, I used it to capture my own thoughts at night, whispered notes of memory so they couldn't slip away, because truth has a way of evaporating when abusers retell it their way. Karen showed me how to organize the pages, slipping them into clear plastic sleeves, and she said softly, "Paper is armor, Olivia. Keep stacking it." Meanwhile, Dad pushed harder from the outside, leaving voicemails on the foster line demanding my return, sending letters dripping with manipulation, lines like, "You're tearing this family apart and we gave you everything." Macy added her own cruelty at school, spreading stories that I was unstable, that I had bruised myself to frame him, and hearing the echoes of her lies hurt almost worse than the kick, because siblings are supposed to be shields, not swords. Some classmates looked at me with suspicion, others with pity, and I learned to walk the halls like a ghost, invisible but listening, storing every word. Ms. Alvarez told me not to engage, not to fight fire with fire, but to let the lies hang themselves when the truth came out. Still, late at night, doubt crawled back, whispering, maybe they're right, maybe no one will believe me, maybe I'm building a castle out of paper and it will collapse the moment someone breathes on it. Then Dr. Klein called again, her voice calm but firm, reminding me that X-rays don't lie, medical reports don't bruise themselves, and she promised to stand again if the court required. She told me, healing doesn't erase the scar, but it makes the scar your story, not your prison. I wrote that sentence down and underlined it 3 times. Slowly I realized the plan wasn't just about proving what had happened, it was about proving that I could exist outside their control. So I applied myself in school even though the whispers buzzed, I stayed late in the library studying, and I let Karen drive me to a counselor twice a week, learning how to name the shadows in my head so they couldn't ambush me at night. The secret plan was not loud, not cinematic, it was quiet and meticulous. Pages of notes, folders of reports, a voice that no longer cracked every time I said the word abuse. And while my father thought intimidation was still my leash, while Macy thought mockery was still my cage, I was quietly collecting keys. One night, staring at the quilt in my foster bed, I realized the revenge was already in motion, because every page I filled was another step away from their world and another step toward a life they could not touch. And the more I stacked those pages, the more I believed that when the final confrontation came, I would not be the girl curled around her ribs, I would be the one standing with proof in her hand. The weeks after the hearing felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon, every step careful, every breath measured, because I knew they weren't finished with me yet, and I was right. Dad's anger turned outward, spilling into calls and letters, each one sharper than the last, demanding my return, threatening lawsuits against CPS, even telling relatives that I had been brainwashed, that I was ungrateful, that I was destroying the family name. Relatives I barely knew sent messages on social media saying, "Family comes first, Olivia, go home," as if repeating the word family erased the fact that my ribs still ached when I sneezed. Macy doubled down at school, her cruelty slick as oil, whispering to friends that I was unstable, passing notes that said liar with my name scrawled under it, and laughing just loud enough for me to hear. She cornered me once in the bathroom, arms crossed, and spat, "You think you've won? Dad always wins." Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had never imagined life outside his orbit, and for a moment I almost pitied her, but then I remembered her laughter when I gasped for air on the kitchen floor, and pity dissolved into steel. Ms. Alvarez told me this stage was common, the backlash, the escalation before control begins to crumble, and she said, "Let them make noise, Olivia. Noise isn't power, evidence is." I held on to that line every time fear clawed at my throat. At the foster home, Karen and Rob grew more protective, checking the locks twice at night, reminding me that fear thrives on imagination and reality was safer than my brain believed. But still, some nights I woke up convinced I heard Dad's boots in the hallway, and I lay frozen until the hum of the refrigerator reminded me where I was. The second court review came quickly, and this time Dad arrived with a lawyer, sharp-suited, carrying a briefcase full of arguments, but Dr. Klein returned too, calm and precise, her testimony slicing through his excuses. Macy tried to testify, rehearsed lines about how clumsy I was, how I made up stories, but when the judge asked her a simple detail, what side the bruise had been on, she hesitated just long enough for the lie to shimmer in the air. My heart pounded, but I stayed silent, because silence can be strategy when you already have receipts. Afterward Dad stormed past me, muttering, "This isn't over," and Macy glared like she wished she could burn holes through me, but Ms. Alvarez whispered, "Every time they show their temper here, it works against them." That night I added another entry in my notebook, not just about the day but about the shift I felt, how their threats no longer landed like thunder, more like echoes fading after a storm. Escalation is loud, messy, frightening, but it is also a sign that control is slipping, and deep inside I knew their noise was the sound of their power cracking. And for the first time since that kitchen night, I began to believe that the final confrontation was coming, and that I would be ready to meet it with more than fear, I would meet it with truth sharpened into armor. The day of the full hearing came like a storm I could no longer outrun, the courthouse buzzing with voices, polished shoes clicking against marble, the weight of expectation pressing on my shoulders as I sat between Ms. Alvarez and Dr. Klein, my notebook heavy in my lap. Dad entered with his lawyer striding beside him, chin high, jaw locked, the performance of a man wronged, and Macy followed, perfectly composed, eyes flashing triumph, as if she believed today would erase every bruise, every truth, every page I had written. Mom trailed behind them, her gaze darting everywhere but my face, her body folded small as though she could disappear between them. When the judge called us forward, the air grew sharp, every sound amplified, and I felt my pulse echo in my ears. Dad's lawyer spoke first, painting me as troubled, accusing CPS of overreach, insisting the fracture could have been a fall, that teenagers invent drama for attention. Each word was polished, rehearsed, but hollow. Then Dr. Klein stood, her folder precise, her voice calm, and she laid the X-rays on the evidence table, the stark image of bone against black. This injury, she said evenly, is not consistent with a fall. It is consistent with a direct blow from significant force. Furthermore, Olivia's account has been consistent in every retelling. The judge leaned closer, studying the film as if the truth was carved into the light itself. Dad shifted, his jaw tightening, his eyes burning holes into me, but he stayed silent because even he knew he could not argue with the image of my ribs. Then Ms. Alvarez rose, detailing the threats, the visitation notes, the letters laced with intimidation. Her voice was steady, firm, and every word was a nail sealing the coffin of his defense. Finally it was my turn, and though my hands shook, I opened my notebook, the pages worn from nights of gripping them like lifelines, and I read aloud the entries, the date, the bruise, the exact words, "Shut up," followed by Macy's laughter. My voice trembled but did not break, and in that silence afterward the truth filled the room heavier than any denial. The judge turned to Macy and asked her directly about that night. She swallowed, eyes flickering toward Dad, and said, "She's clumsy, she fell against the counter," but the pause before her words was long enough to echo, long enough to reveal the crack in her certainty. The judge's brow furrowed, and for the first time I saw Macy's mask falter, her smirk slipping into fear. Dad leaned forward, whispering furiously in her ear, but the judge banged the gavel, demanding silence, and the sound vibrated through my chest like thunder announcing change. When the session closed, the ruling was clear: protective custody extended, supervised visits only, counseling mandated for my parents, and further investigation into potential charges. It wasn't the dramatic arrest my imagination had rehearsed at night, but it was justice in motion, a wall finally built between me and his rage. As I stood to leave, Dad's glare tried to cut me down, Macy's eyes brimmed with something between anger and betrayal, Mom's lips trembled like she wanted to speak but couldn't. And yet for the first time, I walked out not shrinking but standing taller, because in that room, surrounded by witnesses and proof, I had not been silenced. My voice had landed, my words had counted, and the confrontation that once terrified me had instead become the moment I began to believe I could win, not by breaking them but by refusing to be broken again. I thought the hearing was finished when the gavel fell, but sometimes truth waits for its own timing, and that timing came just as we were gathering our papers. The judge paused, glancing at a file a clerk had slid across the bench, and then he said, "We have one additional exhibit submitted late." My heart thudded, because I hadn't known there was anything left, but Ms. Alvarez smiled faintly as if she had been saving a card for the exact right moment. The clerk held up a small device, my cheap tape recorder, and explained that CPS had collected the audio entries I'd made with Karen and Rob's help, those whispered notes I thought were only for me. The judge pressed a button and suddenly the courtroom filled with my 15-year-old voice, shaky but honest, describing the bruise, repeating Dad's command to shut up, recounting Macy's laugh, all captured in the fragile courage of midnight whispers. The sound of my own voice made me want to curl into myself, but it also wrapped the room in undeniable weight, because these weren't rehearsed testimonies, they were raw, time-stamped recordings of a girl trying to survive. Dad shot up from his chair, face red, shouting, "That's fabricated, that's not admissible," but the judge's gavel cracked again, louder this time, and his outburst became part of the record. Macy looked stricken, her practiced smirk gone, eyes darting between Dad and the judge like a cornered animal realizing the escape route had closed. And then came the final blow, Dr. Klein stepped forward holding a copy of my medical intake form from the very first clinic visit, signed in my mother's handwriting, acknowledging the bruise before anyone had pressured her into silence. Mom gasped when she saw it, tears spilling, and whispered, "I didn't think they'd keep that." The courtroom grew so still it felt like the air was holding its breath. In that moment the twist landed, proof from two directions, my own recorded words and my mother's reluctant acknowledgement, converging into a truth too heavy for denial to float above. The judge leaned back, eyes grave, and said, "This court finds the testimony and evidence credible and consistent. Further protective measures will be enforced, and a referral for criminal investigation is warranted." The words struck like bells in a tower, undeniable, irreversible. Dad's shoulders slumped, not in regret but in fury he could no longer channel into power. Macy's face twisted, betrayal mixing with fear, and Mom wept quietly, the mask of denial slipping into dust. I didn't cheer, didn't smile, didn't gloat. I simply breathed, deep and steady, and for the first time since his kick had cracked my ribs, the air filled my lungs without snagging on fear. The twist wasn't just in the evidence, it was in me, in realizing that the voice I had thought too small, too shaky, too easy to dismiss had become the loudest truth in the room. And that realization was the sharpest kind of revenge, the kind no one could take back. When the courtroom emptied and the echo of the gavel faded, I walked out not as the broken girl who had limped in weeks before but as someone beginning to believe in her own spine, fragile still but no longer bowed. CPS finalized the placement plan, and Karen and Rob opened their door wider, telling me their home could be mine as long as I needed, and in that steady rhythm of dinners without shouting and weekends filled with quiet laughter I began to relearn what family meant. Therapy sessions stretched into months, each one pulling threads from the tangled knot inside me, naming the nightmares, untangling the guilt, teaching me that forgiveness isn't about excusing cruelty but about refusing to carry it like a chain. School stopped being a battlefield and became a refuge. I poured myself into books, into essays, into the future I refused to let him take. And when whispers rose I let them fade because I knew the truth had already been spoken where it mattered. Years passed and the bruises faded into scars only I could trace, reminders not of weakness but of survival, and by the time I stood on a stage at graduation delivering a speech about resilience, I could feel the full circle turning. I studied psychology in college, driven not by curiosity alone but by a vow that no one would ever sit in silence the way I once did without someone noticing. And when my name was finally followed by the title Dr. Jenkins, I smiled at the irony, reclaiming the name that had once been tied to fear and stitching it instead to healing. Today I sit across from patients who tremble the way I once trembled, who doubt themselves the way I once did, and I tell them what Dr. Klein told me years ago. Bones heal, spirits heal too. I built a family of my own, a partner who knows that love doesn't raise its voice to be heard, children who grow up believing laughter is safety not cruelty, and a life marked not by the shadow of his voice but by the light of my own. People sometimes ask if I ever wanted revenge, if I wanted to see my father in prison, if I wanted Macy to suffer the way I did, and I tell them this. The best revenge is living a life so full and so free that their cruelty becomes irrelevant, their power reduced to a story I tell not with shame but with strength. Because revenge doesn't always look like punishment, it can look like healing, like success, like waking up without fear. If you've ever reached your breaking point, if you've ever felt the weight of silence crushing your chest, let my story be proof that speaking can break cycles, that survival can turn into triumph, that the ultimate revenge is not getting even but getting free. So tell me in the comments if you've ever had a moment where you decided enough was enough, because your story, like mine, might be the lifeline someone else is waiting for.